Hi folks, I'm Aeva Black, Section Chief for Open Source Security at CISA, here to talk about contextualizing open source software security to CISA's mission. So for a little background, if you're not familiar, CISA's mission is to understand, manage, and reduce risks to federal governments and civilian networks and critical infrastructure, but open source software is the part of that foundation for pretty much all critical infrastructure. In every sector, in every national critical function, in pretty much every business. Therefore, CISA needs to understand it, needs to help manage it, needs to reduce risk to open source and through open source. And also, as one of the largest users of open source, the federal government should play our own part in being a responsible consumer of open source. To give you a sense of the scale and scope, because it's so often invisible, you come here, you look around, you buy a product, you have a relationship with a company, but under the hood, a lot of that is open source. Black Duck's survey last year estimates that about 96% of all enterprise code bases include open source, an average of more than 500 discrete components per product that companies are using or shipping, and that's across thousands of enterprises they scanned. GitHub had about 150 million projects. Sorry, is the audio getting a little bit loud? Good, okay. There's over 150 million open source projects on GitHub, and that's just GitHub. There's also GitLab, there's SourceForge, there's Stack Exchange, there's a bunch of other places where open source development happens. So this is not a representative count, it's just an example of, gosh, there's hundreds of millions of people out there working on open source together. And companies, some sell open source, some support it, some include it in their products. A Harvard study, earlier this year actually, published in, I think, January, estimated about a 200 times difference in demand side value versus supply side value for open source, with about an $4 billion, but $8 trillion demand side value. And the funniest thing about the study is it excluded the Linux kernel because the Linux kernel would have been too big to estimate its value. It's used everywhere, from light bulbs to toasters to cars to airplanes to the Mars rover to probably every security product here uses the Linux kernel in some way. To my friend's Bluetooth hearing aid also has a Linux kernel in it. To another friend's insulin pump and heart monitor of a different friend. Like, the Linux kernel is now everywhere. It's not the year of Linux on the desktop, Linux won. So, we've got to think about and manage that. I'll give a quick background on what is open source in case you're not familiar with it. It actually comes from the 1976 Copyright Act. Open source software is a type of copyright applied to software that grants 4 freedoms essential to the use of that software, the freedom to use it however you want, to study it yourself, the source code, to modify the source code, and to redistribute it both in its original or modified form. That is it. And that spans everything from commercial products on this floor to a college student's homework uploaded to GitHub. It's all open source, so we have to evolve how we talk about it, not as one set of things, but as how it's being used. And the responsibility for using it safely really rests on the consumer of that open source, not on the producer, because it's anybody. It's just a creative work they chose to share under a particular type of copyright. Now, the open source community goes back to the 80s and has developed several norms for how they work together to develop trustworthy software. And those are summarized as the 4 opens. The source code's open. The design process is open and auditable by third parties. The development itself, the code review, the code, the build process, the CI system, the logs, those are also open, and the community is open to participants to come show up and do good work. So that's the what and why. But I want to talk a little bit about a cultural difference between how we think about products and how we think about open source. Excuse me a sec. It's about 25 years ago, this phrase was coined in a fairly famous book for open source: given enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow. It's supposed to indicate that open source is very trustworthy, more trustworthy than a proprietary product, because more people can review the code. There's more people who can find bugs or vulnerabilities and fix them before they affect users. That was perhaps true of the Linux kernel 25 years ago. It may still be true of the Linux kernel or of several large projects, but it is no longer generically true because there's so much open source. There's more code being written today, especially with the acceleration of AI-driven authorship and Copilot and products like that. There's more code being written than humans to review it. So this, I think, should be stated in the inverse now. For most open source projects, given a few eyes, it contains vulnerabilities. They will find it. The other sort of aphorism that I like to think about in the difference here, projects and the communities that build projects have time but no money. They're mostly volunteers. Even if they're paid by the tech industry, they're often doing this in their spare time as a hobby. Whereas products and the companies that build them, products have money but no time. They're in a race against other companies to get products to market. And these two differences, the projects are volunteers with time on their hands, but products are companies trying to build value, create attention. And if you, give me a shout out or a hand raise if you've seen this XKCD comic before. Anybody? Yeah, a couple. Awesome. It's become really famous after Log4Shell happened. Essentially, in the blue, I put up a couple names of some pretty famous open source projects that are in use everywhere, pretty much all over the cloud, to hardware, to smart cars, representing kind of a modern stack. And there's vulnerabilities at every layer that we've found in the past couple years. These were all maintained by one or two volunteers. This tension between products and companies building on the work of others, but not compensating them and not securing it as they're taking it in, that tension is at the heart of the risk. I'm going to gloss over this real quick so we have some time for questions, but I do want to give a quick history of what happened. How did we get here that made it so precarious today that most modern digital infrastructure depends on the work of unpaid volunteers? And from here, I'll talk about what we can do about it. Essentially, going back to the 90s, folks were kind of down on open source, but it gave a competitive advantage to early adopters like Google and Facebook and Amazon, who followed this process to use it securely and contribute back. As much as we might not have noticed back then or not talk about it, they actually were pretty good at helping to support the projects that their products depended on, and that's key. They were giving back to the things that they needed for their business. Fast forward, a bunch of innovations happened. Things like MySQL and Bitcoin and Android became really popular, all built on open source. So, oh yeah, and then a couple big events happened. Log4Shell, everyone's heard of that probably. And XZ about a month ago, another small library. This one was the target probably of a nation state, at least a very long actor dedicated over about 3 years to undermine this one little project that would have been the basis of so many things. But it was prevented, again, by by one volunteer who noticed it. It wasn't his job, because there were eyes on the project. The benefit of it being open source is that it was found by another volunteer. So CISA's goal is to foster and to continue to support an open source ecosystem that is secure, sustainable, and resilient, and really is supported by a healthy community. It's been the backbone of open source for 35 years. It's great. We should keep supporting that. And in this world, the federal government should participate both as a community member and making investments to help support and sustain what we depend on, also as consumers of open source software. The goals in our roadmap right here to establish CISA's role in helping to secure open source, to identify the usage risk and to assess those risks, to help reduce those risks once we've identified them, and then to harden the open source ecosystem as a whole. So how will we do this? First and foremost, coordinating our own work across the agency and partnering with the open source community and working together with centralized entities like foundations, nonprofits, package managers, and coding platforms like GitHub and GitLab to help secure and support this outcome for the whole community. 2 months ago, we actually held our first summit with them to do that and did a tabletop exercise. I think the first one ever done by the federal government to help threat model attacks against open source. About a month later, XZ happened, so it was kind of good timing, not just like, sometimes you don't want to be right. You don't want your crystal ball to be right, but it's good when it is. Nope. There we go. Goal 2, to identify usage and assess risks. It's really to understand the prevalence of open source software across federal civilian networks and critical infrastructure, and develop a framework for prioritizing for assessing the systemic risk and then prioritizing action to reduce that risk. We're working on that right now and should have much more to share later this year. We're currently evaluating a couple shared services we might offer to other federal agencies to help them do the same, and working on some policies around how to secure open source software and encourage contract fulfillment to do that, including enabling the secure usage of open source across multiple agencies. And then we are piloting an open source program office in CISA. This will be the second one. I know Health and Human Services already has an OSPO, and we should have ours starting up in about a month, I hope. And goal 4, to harden the open source ecosystem as a whole, to drive the adoption of memory-safe programming languages. You may have seen the White House made a little announcement about that a month or two ago. We've done a bunch of research. My colleague Bob Lord talks about this pretty regularly. There really is a lot of benefit to taking older code that is written in memory, unsafe languages, where it takes a lot more work to keep them safe from memory vulnerabilities. Some of those should probably be rewritten into Rust or other memory-safe languages. That'd be great. It's not free, it's not easy, but it's worth it. Alan was just up here a little while ago talking about SBOMs. SBOMs are also really critical for open source to help understand open source supply chains and what is in a product that is open source. So the next time something like Log4Shell happens, we all can know what's in the box. And we've begun working more with open source communities to help with the vulnerability disclosure process for open source projects and communities. You may have seen some announcements from the Python Foundation or the Linux kernel, kernel.org, about becoming CNAs. So again, we're trying to support more open source projects that are closer to the actual code. They know it better than a security researcher might, to help with the CVE enrichment and publication process. And I think I'm going to stop here. I think I'm good on time and take some questions. Yeah, we've got about 10 minutes left for questions. So a few months ago, we announced the principles for package repository security in conjunction with the Open Source Security Foundation's Securing Software Repositories working group. It's quite a mouthful. For those not familiar with the OpenSSF, this is a foundation, is part of the Linux Foundation that has brought together a lot of vendors and other open source foundations and projects to work towards this common goal. We worked with them to help identify a framework, a set of best practices that any open source repository can or should follow. And 5 of the major package repositories signed on to commit to that. Other ones are considering doing the same right now. We held our first open source security summit, enabling really broad cross open source foundation collaboration, and as part of that, established a channel for real-time information sharing should open source come under a direct threat, or there be a vulnerability that needs sort of special handling that project or community isn't capable of handling on their own. And I will stop there on that slide now. Hopefully there are questions from the audience. Yes, please.
What does best practice look like for a company trying to understand all of the open source software in their environment?
Generally, I'd say it falls into 2 categories. Either open source software that companies' employees are using directly, someone was like, it's going to be easier than asking my boss. I'm just going to download this thing and use it. Well, there's that category of things, which if you've got good scanning or a good CI system, you could hook into your internal CI system and just observe and build an inventory from that, hopefully giving your developers guidance, maybe through an OSPO, Open Source Program Office. If the staff are following the guidelines from the OSPO, then you can build that inventory and manage it pretty well. However, the second category, if the company is procuring products from other companies and those contain open source, it's probably opaque. SBOMs could help if your supplier is including the full list of everything they're using in their SBOM. There's also a project out there, started a couple years ago, to try and build a binary artifact dependency graph in open source. Early days for that. My hope is that in a couple years that would provide an answer to this question for the products that one is procuring, but it's not there yet.
In some of the meetings that have happened, there have been people who've actually forked open source and never contributed it back any fixes or updates. Then, of course, there is complaints that we are potentially vulnerable to things. What is the best practice that an enterprise or an agency should follow when you are actually using open source and you are actually modifying it and things like that?
So companies, enterprises that are consuming open source should be first and foremost responsible consumers. They should have a process in place for, as they're ingesting it, staging it, reviewing it, running their own scanning tools on it, verifying the provenance of it, the security of it. So first and foremost, be a responsible consumer of open source. But part of being a responsible consumer is also sustainably contributing back, right? If the commons from which you are taking is not sustained, well, that's also a business risk. So to mitigate that business risk, the company should be contributing back. That could come in the form of time, treasure, or talent, right? Employee time on the clock to go work in the project, chop wood, carry water, keep the product moving, or treasure. Maybe the company has a good that can be donated in kind to support that community, help them run tests, store logs, whatever it might be, or just donate to the foundation that supports it.